Hello and welcome to Powering the Future, Charting Europe's Climate and Energy Sovereignty. My name is Susie Dennison and I'm a Senior Fellow at ECFR, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm really pleased to be moderating this discussion today. So firstly, a few words from me on why we're here. Well, the IPCC's March report this year showed us that while we're living currently with temperatures 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial levels, the goal of keeping that at 1.5 is still achievable, but to do that requires very critical action. So the discussion that we want to have today is about whether or not Europe and the European Union in particular is in a position to take that critical action over the coming months and years as we go into the next phase of implementation of the European Green Deal. So we know that this next phase is going to be challenging. It's going to be challenging internally within the EU because we will need to focus on sectors such as housing and transport, which will imply greater costs being borne by households and individuals than perhaps was felt in the first phase of implementation. And it's going to be tough externally as well, with measures such as the reform of the emissions trading scheme, the phase-in of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and so on. We also know that we're going into a particularly tense political moment within Europe, with European Parliament elections coming up and national elections in a number of key countries, including Poland this year. On the geopolitical stage, it isn't easy either. We're in relatively uncertain waters because with the introduction of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US and with the framing of trade tensions between the US and China, we've seen heralded in an era of green competition, which European businesses and governments are coming to terms with living with. But it's unclear if after the US elections in 2024, the next occupant of the White House will be as committed to keeping the green in that competition framing or not. ECFR has launched a suite of publications yesterday and today unpacking this picture and trying to help us understand it. We've got an energy sovereignty index. We've got a paper called Ends of the Earth, looking at how EU climate action can weather the storm I've just been describing. And we've got a paper called From Coal to Consensus, which is looking particularly at Poland's energy transition. So today's discussion is going to draw on some of that material and other analysis, and we have a great panel to take us through this picture. I would like to introduce them. We have Pierre Schellekens, the Director for Energy Policy in Directorate General for Energy, DG ENER, for those who know the Commission well, in the European Commission, sorry. We have my colleagues Simon Kardas, who is a Senior Policy Fellow based out of our Warsaw office of ECFR, and also my colleague Matt Engström, joining us from the US today, very kindly, very early in the morning for him, but usually based in Stockholm. And both of these colleagues are part of the European Power Team at ECFR. And then very shortly, we will have joining us fresh from the European Parliament, from the Swedish Parliament now, we'll have Jutta Gutteland, member of the Swedish Riksdag and a former member of the European Parliament. So if I can, I'd like to kick off first by giving the floor to Simon to take a look at for us at the question of, from an energy perspective, to what extent is the EU in a position to be managing its choices around how it drives climate action forward at the moment? What are your takeaways from having developed the Energy Sovereignty Index on this?
Thank you very much, Susie, and I'm really glad that I can take part in this wonderful discussion that we are having today. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has compelled the European Union and its member states to basically rethink the energy sovereignty. And in the ECFR, we believe that we should move actually beyond a very narrow focus on energy sovereignty. So from the just security of fossil fuel supplies issues to more broader perspective. I mean, including the green energy and investments in green projects, and also efficient energy use. And that's why I mean, within the framework of the Energy Sovereignty Index, we would like to introduce a kind of a new approach, highlighting 4 critical components that should be part of the energy sovereignty as a kind of a point of reference. First of all, cleanness. Secondly, independence. Thirdly, efficiency. And finally, narrative. And just very briefly, what do we mean by all those categories that I have just mentioned? Cleanness, we were basically trying to look at the share of renewables and fossil fuels in the energy mix of EU member states, but our particular focus when it comes to indicators is related to renewables. Secondly, when it comes to independence, we were trying to look at the level of dependence on energy imports, in particular with respect to fossil fuels, but also electricity. Thirdly, when it comes to efficiency, we were trying to look at the primary and final energy consumption in EU member states and compare, I mean, the actual results with the targets that were set by the European Union for 2020, and look at the data from 2021 and compare, I mean, how far we are from the goals that were set by the European Union for 2020. And we were trying, I mean, on the basis of those categories, all those categories were actually based on some indicators that allowed us to normalize some kind of scores in each category for each EU member states, and that led us to group the EU member states into 4 categories that we called laggards, dependent achievers, emerging sovereigntists, and independent decarbonizers. And I mean, each category is equal to the, I mean, overall score that we gave to each EU member state. So those countries that are failing are called laggards. Those that reach the satisfactory results are called dependent achievers. Those who received good score are called emerging sovereignties, and those who received the very good score are called independent decarbonizers. And the very brief characteristics of each category. When it comes to laggards, it refers to countries that are still heavily reliant on imported energy, that has a significant impact on the level of the energy sovereignty. And of course, we identify, I mean, some progress with respect to some countries, but we believe that there is still much to be done in terms of strengthening the energy sovereignty, taking into account all those categories. When it comes to dependent achievers, I mean, here we included countries that are trying to balance the energy import and are doing some progress in at least one of the key categories that we are covering within the Energy Sovereignty Index, so cleanness or energy efficiency. The third category, emerging sovereignties. I mean, here, this category includes countries that are quite successful in terms of reducing the energy imports and are excelling in multiple key categories that we cover within the framework of the index. And just to bring one of the, as an example, I mean, Estonia, that sets the standard with the outstanding score when it comes to independence category. And finally, the independent decarbonizers, which now actually includes only one country on the basis of our calculations. It's Denmark. that is leading because it managed to break free from energy imports. It's championing in green energy and achieving quite a significant results when it comes to energy efficiency as well. And we may say that this is one of those countries that is truly shaping the energy sovereignty landscape in Europe. And of course, I mean, all the details related to individual scores of EU member states and the overall score of the EU in each category, you can find when you visit our website, which is called the ECFR's Special and named the Energy Sovereignty Index. And thank you very much for your attention for now.
Thanks very much, Shimon. That was a great taster, and indeed there is a lot of information for us to dig into in the discussion and afterwards. And I feel very confident that our Swedish colleagues are going to want to react in particular to the high score for Denmark that you've highlighted. But before we get into the discussion, I want to give the floor next to Mats Engström and ask you, Mats, if you could reflect for us briefly on the political level within the EU of the preparedness that you see to drive climate action forward through this difficult period, and what you see as the potential strategies for reinforcing that.
Thank you very much, Susie. And as you mentioned in the presentation, even if there have been very impressive progress on the climate policies and the Green Deal in general, these 5 years soon from 2019, there are challenges now. And what we have done in this project is to use the network that ECFR has with researchers in all 27 member states to kind of gauge the national debates, and we have also done roundtables in big capitals and also some interviews with senior policymakers in other capitals. And the picture that is emerging and described in this policy brief compared to 2021, when a similar study was done, is of a bigger concern over energy prices, and we can of course see that also in the day-to-day debate in the media and so, and also challenges to the political support for the green transition. What I think is important to say also in the analysis we have done of this is also the anti-elite, anti-Brussels dimension that might not be so based on facts, but that is clear in several member states that there is such a discourse there as well. So we also did a quantitative study on the changes and risks and opportunities that people are seeing in these different member states. And on the risks, certainly there is a fear of reduced competitiveness and also of bigger social divisions. But there are also opportunities, and I think that's also important to say. It's about, of course, the advantages of green energy sources, but also modernizing the economy as such, and bigger, of course, than 2021, reducing the dependency of Russia, which was not really there in the same way. So what we have done then is to look at the possible alliances between member states, where we think very simplified that the traditional green growth countries could align better with what we call the energy sovereignty group of countries that are really dependent, have been really dependent on Russia, and now think this energy independence that Shimon also mentions is important. But to do that, we also put forward some recommendations, and I'll finish with that. And that is first, that the industrial policy that you mentioned briefly, Susie, has to benefit all parts of the European Union, and that requires rather strong tools. The Commission has put forward now several such things, including the Strategic Technologies for Europe platform, but we think this needs to become stronger, and shouldn't be at the expense of other important things like public investment in infrastructure, the support then to industrial companies. That's one point. The other point is the just transition issues, to have that support. And here, as you mentioned, I mean, the US now, it's interesting to look at how the Biden administration has secured the support of the trade unions in climate policy by including more social conditions to the different subsidies that the US is giving. That is one thing. And finally, the international dimension is important, that to avoid trade wars that could also endanger this transition, the European Union really needs to be better partnerships also with countries in what they themselves call the global south. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Mats. So I think I will turn now, if I may, to you, Pierre, to get your sense on the energy dimension. As you know, as both Mats and Shimon have said, there has been a spur to this idea of energy sovereignty because of the decisions which the European Union has taken to decouple from Russia over recent years in response to its aggression and all-out war in Ukraine. I wanted to get your take on the extent to which you find this kind of framing of energy sovereignty helpful from a Commission perspective, and the extent to which you see it sort of taking hold across the EU, and what you would see as the important next steps for the EU to be taking on this front.
Well, I think it's a very valid concept. But it's a concept that has been with us for quite some time. If you go back already to the first energy and climate packages that were adopted 2008, 2009, there is already that discourse around the package. And we knew that, for instance, some member states far preferred targets on renewables and on greenhouse gases for exactly that reason. So it's been, and then with the Energy Union then back in 2014, you see this narrative very present. And by the way, it's sometimes a misconception that nothing had been done until the war started. I'm not saying you're saying this, but if you go back to different actions taken, read the first Energy Union paper, it says very clearly we have 6 member states that are dependent on one sole supply of gas. This has to stop. And by the end of the Juncker mandate, there was only 1 member state left that only had access to Russian gas. That was Finland, and that didn't worry us too much because gas was a small share of their energy mix. So that was I think a very it's been with us, but it is obvious that that message has been strengthened as a result of Russia's aggression and the invasion of Ukraine. That's obvious, absolutely. And I think the member states, from that perspective, there's very little debate about it. From that perspective, the member states have acted in a very coordinated way during this whole phase. It's true that if I go back to the 1990s, and already then Mats and I knew each other, it was there you could have debates in the Commission, which was always favorable to renewables, but you could hear such things as it's good with renewable energy, but we have to think about security of supply. That is a discourse that you would never hear, and I haven't heard it for 10, 15 years in the Commission. So that is not, it's certainly not seen as an opposition. On the contrary, I think there's a high level of recognition that the two objectives go very much hand in hand, and that our decarbonization efforts have clearly improved our energy in sovereignty. And I think the way you define energy sovereignty is a good way of defining it as a situation where you can continue making your own policy choices without undue influence from outside. I'll give you the example of 2022. I mean, the deployment of new renewable energy or renewable electricity in Europe only last year was at 57 gigawatts. That corresponds to 11 or 12 billion cubic meters of gas imports. This year, we expect 70 gigawatts of deployment of new plants. That corresponds to approximately 13 billion cubic meters of gas. So only with renewables deployment in 2022 and what we will have in 2023, we will have substituted nearly 25 BCM. Remind you that our total imports before the war of Russian gas was 150 BCM. So a substantial share of that gas has been replaced by deployment of renewable projects only in 2022 and 23. So that is, I think, one thing where the two clearly go hand in hand. We managed to reduce gas consumption in Europe by 17%. That is approximately 65 BCM of gas. So 65 BCM for 11-12 last year. So that's more than half of the Russian gas was simply substituted by reducing our consumption and by deploying renewable energy projects. And this will continue. And that is a policy that will continue, and where the two objectives, I think, are very strongly reinforcing each other. Then, of course, there are many important steps. I'll talk about what are the priorities for next year, I think, and for the next mandate, which I think is nearly more important. But when I see I think these models are always useful because they catch a picture in your mind. But of course, it would need a bit more granularity in the sense of one important aspect in terms of energy sovereignty is whom you import from. That is a very important part. You had Belgium as one of the laggards, but Belgium has had even before the war a very, very small share of Russian gas, mainly used Norwegian gas. And I have to say, even if I'm Swedish as well, I have to say it is quite a different matter to buy gas from Norway than to buy gas from Russia. Now, Norway is completely predominant in our gas imports, but that is not at all the same geopolitical problem as it was when it was Russia. Mm-hmm. Simply for the simple reason that Norway is a democracy, there's a rule of law system, and that there is a community of shared values with Norway. Mm. So that, I think, is an aspect that needs to be taken into account. That doesn't mean you don't need to continue on in terms of reducing demand, energy efficiency, and renewables, but it does have a big impact on your energy sovereignty.
Absolutely.
And the same applies, of course, when you buy energy from the US. And that is another aspect to be taken into account, that your point is very well taken when you buy Russian pipeline gas. But when you buy LNG is a global market in a complete different way. When you have a pipeline, you're very much stuck to the guy or the girl on the other side pumping you the gas. But on LNG as such, as a global market where you can actually have and choose and have a look at what are your suppliers, also that aspect has an impact on your energy sovereignty. Again, this does not in any way take away the priority of decarbonization and continuing that road, but it does, I think it does mitigate the situation when you have that kind of supply. Once from your main pipeline is a democracy, and the rest is from LNG from different sources, out of which the US is dominant. I think that is an important aspect. Now, working a bit on the future, I think many of the points raised by Mats and by you, Susan, in your paper, which I read this morning, are very much in line with the priorities. The whole thinking about the manufacturing side of things, the supply chains, is something that has come very strongly. The EU has been very, very strong on deployment. We have always thought that deployment would bring manufacturing, and to some extent it has. To a large extent, by the way, it has. As you say in the paper, there are several sectors yet, big sectors of the clean tech industry where European companies still dominate. It is still the case that most wind turbines built in Europe or deployed in Europe are built in Europe, but it is less the case than before, and that is always also true that we're facing more competition. So we are trying now to combine this very strong deployment side policy with the supply side, indeed, of manufacturing, of looking at where of how the supply chains work. That I think was even more a lesson from COVID than from the crisis now. That we are vulnerable to supply side issues in the manufacturing in the clean tech sectors, and that is, I think, clearly something that has come out as a priority, and that will be with us, I think, in the next mandate, in the next Commission mandate, and the next Parliament as one of these red threads. The whole issue about critical raw material is an obvious issue that we will have to work on. Priority now is to get the Critical Raw Material Act adopted by the end of the year in Council and Parliament. That is linked to a broader discussion about competitiveness in general for the clean tech sectors. And then, and this is a bit outside the scope of your paper, we have a full, if you want, legal structure in place, soon at least. I think also one of the priorities for the future will be looking at the bottlenecks, the potential bottlenecks of the energy transition. So these are issues that have not necessarily always been EU issues. They've been very often national, even in some cases regional, local issues, but that will decide how far and how fast in primarily the transition would work. So these are issues such as the grids, the whole skill dimension, the link to the competences, to the labor force competences. We see many companies that are struggling to recruit in Europe for the energy transition. It's the whole issue of permitting, extremely difficult issue to deal with at European level, but still there is now legislation on permitting. And then, as I said, the whole industry thing. One part of it will also be to combine this with some focus still on fossil fuel supply, not because we want to increase it, but because we know that for quite many years to come, although renewables are, especially in the power sector, are really strongly increasing, it is absolutely realistic that we go to 65, even higher % of electricity being from renewables 2030, which is an enormous achievement. But we also know that for quite so many years to come, even into the 2030s, the fossil fuels will still be the marginal price setter on the electricity market. And it will take a bit longer than that before fossil fuels are the main, but before renewables are the marginal price setter. So that is still, you still have to keep it in mind from that perspective. The funding issues, Mats, Susie, you don't need to convince an EU official about that. I don't think I'm the main problem for the funding issue. We would certainly very strongly agree, but let's also be very honest that it looks very difficult. Mm-hmm. Okay. That we have a budget, a very difficult budgetary situation for the future. I think that I'll stop here.
No, but that's a very helpful segue. In fact, I think to bring Jutta in, Jutta Gutterland, thank you very much for joining us at speed from Parliament. We're very grateful for you to coming over after your voting obligations. I wanted to ask you to jump into the conversation. I mean, you've obviously heard the end of what Pierre was talking about in relation to the current position on energy sovereignty, and I wanted maybe to ask you to come in on, from a political perspective, to what extent do you feel that we're going in the right direction with regards to the next set of EU institutions and so on to drive forward the priorities that Pierre was highlighting, and if you feel, as Pierre indicated at the end, that's going to be difficult, what do you see as the sort of the framings that might work in the current EU political landscape on that front?
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to take part of this discussion, and it was interesting to listen to Pierre again, as many times before. Nice to see you, and thank you also, Susie and Mats, for your paper. I also read it, and I recognized many of the things that you have studied. I would like to answer your question, but maybe I will have three. My little intervention here will focus on three things. First, your paper, then the situation for the election movement, and there is the hope that you asked for. Maybe if I can contribute with some hope, I will certainly try to
always
do that. Yes, always. And then maybe just very short reflection from my political experience on how climate is going up and down. But first, the paper. I must say I was very excited to read it. I think it's important that we share the view on where we are and what we have in front of us on the EU level, in front of the election movement and the election next year. I think it is very clear that many of the things that you did study and put on print is true. I think first of all, there is really a debate on taking it easy on the climate legislation, putting it on hold or pause, and that has been vocalized from different leaders in the member states, and it is always a little bit there, even if there is not like said like from Macron or something, it will be there in the debate. Oh, maybe this is too much. It's kind of a feeling, and that's also in Sweden the case, I would say. And then on that you were writing that it's from the study that you noticed that it's very risk-oriented debate right now, and that's also true. There is lots of focus in the political debate on the risk of going too fast, the Green Deal, the Fit for 55, maybe too heavy, and the risk is that we will not lead the industry competition globally. We will be set back. It will be too heavy, too pricey. These kind of risk-oriented debates are constantly there, while the risk of not going forward is not there at all, and that is also very true. And I remember listening to Pierre a couple of years back where the Commission had analyzed how the different target would, what it would mean for the creation of job and opportunities and the different member states and regions. And there was this big, you were analyzing it before the Green Deal, but also during time, and that didn't show at all that we would be losers from going more ambitious for the industry. But of course, it can be difficult in some regions, and that did you also focus on. But it is if you look at the macro level, we will have more jobs, not less, if we continue this. And then on the, I would say that it would definitely be a danger for Europe's decarbonization agenda, but also for the competitiveness if we don't continue. And then I think also in the paper you took some examples here on 4 arguments: energy sovereignty, the economic opportunities of the decarbonization, but also Europe's how vulnerable we are and the effect on the climate change. And all of those are supporting that we need to continue, not slow down, not take the pause, and so on. So I think we need to be more vocal on that, and we need leaders in all the member states, in the different chambers, in the parliaments, not only in the European Parliament, but also in the member states, to be more interested in this and what it would mean to slow down, and what it would mean not to slow down, but actually accelerate. And then the other thing that you showed is also on the the public and how they feel. And I would say there that the arguments in Sweden are very much like the one you were. I know Mats maybe have some knowledge of that, but it is really the same. It's much more focused now on the prices, how the households are coping, and the energy prices, and also transport and the inflation, and how that is hitting the vulnerable households, but also all of us. And there should be a debate that also took it a bit more sustainable for the future, like the dependency on the fossil fuels, but also on in Russia, but now maybe to other more unstable solutions. How will that make us more secure? No, not at all. We need to, on the other hand, make sure that we are more self-dependent when it comes to the energy solutions, and that means that we should definitely also go more for the renewables. But that is not there when we have the debates. It's often forgotten about that we will be back in the same situation in a couple of years if we don't make ourselves more sustainable, also when it comes to the energy solutions in our member states. Then I also would like to go to the optimistic future. So now I'm on my second focus.
Yeah.
And I think in the election movement next year, we have some things that we can give us some energy and hope when it comes to more sustainable debate. Of course, first of all, it is the legislation itself. It actually creates incentives for the industry and for different sectors to decarbonize. And that leads to new innovation, and that means that they are working in the direction, and it will be a snowball effect. And I think also when you look at the new council that we have in the climate law to evaluate the EU climate legislation, they are actually, they ask for a more ambitious target to 2040, just as we thought they would. They actually when they evaluate where we are and what we should do. And I think this is a snowball effect for the climate, and that will help in the debate. Of course, the elections, like if Timmermans wins in the Netherlands, Tusk in Poland, could be helpful. I'm not sure where they are, but they could definitely be helpful. I think also the support for the climate policy if you look at the citizens in our countries, is quite strong. And it is the far right extreme, but also some others that are negative, and they are very vocal. But the majority is actually quite, they are aware that we need more climate legislation, and they know that this is the way to go. So I think the important thing is that the citizens are feeling that there is a political voice to that. And that is maybe not there in all our member states. But as I said, there are some hopes. You could also see Denmark. They had a climate campaign, climate very high in the election campaign. That's a bit positive. Then if you look at countries outside of EU, like India, now introducing the ETS system, you can see that things will happen also, and that will also go back to us. It will be more to look at on the international level to give us good examples that things are happening. So why should we slow down? And then my last thing that I promised on my own experience, I was 8 years in the European Parliament, and I often describe my first 5 years as a bit dark when it comes to the climate focus. I was often debating in the plenary in the evenings and in the nights. And that's because the focus were not on environment and climate. So I was often awake very late with my baby because the creche was closed. So we were there, but there were no one else there. It was like very, very. And then it shifted in the next election with all the demands from Greta Thunberg, all the climate movements, and also the scientists, the IPCC reports and so on. And we got this pressure, and then a pressure on the new commission, and also on Ursula von der Leyen and the whole thing moving. And I think it was they actually in the climate during this mandate. What I'm a bit afraid of is, of course, that there will be a shift back now, not only from the energy discussion, but also because in politics there is often dynamics going back and forth, and it's not easy to keep a momentum 2 times.
Yeah.
But I think we need a new Green Deal for the next election with new pieces of legislation. I end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And the point I think is very well taken on the need for a positive agenda, a positive narrative. I think that we've seen in many settings around the EU how much or how little narratives which are built against the status quo and which are based on sort of fear and the necessity of sacrifice and making changes, that those are not the things that are going to mobilize voters and the whole of society in the way that we need. So I think that point is very well taken. We've as you all know, this is a public event, and we've got many people joining us online. You can't actually see the questions that are coming in, but I wanted to raise a number of them with you now, and also to flag to others who are part of this discussion to keep those coming through the Q&A function. So there is one specific one which I think I can only put to Shimon, which is about exactly how you calculated cleanliness in the sovereignty index, and exactly sort of which factor and how you went through that process. So if you could help us in the course of the next round of responses with an explanation that those of us who are less versed in energy markets than you might be able to understand, that would be much appreciated. But for the broader group, I think it would be really interesting to hear on a couple of points. On the energy side, the extent to which you feel that we're being creative enough in terms of the different sources that we're taking into account, whether or not you see an increased role for bioenergy from primarily forest and agriculture residues in the energy mix, or whether you see concerns on this front. And it might be interesting to draw as well on the data that we have from our researchers about which member states are already kind of thinking in this way too, from the ECFR participants. Also, a question has come in from the group about what might a powerful narrative be for politicians pushing back against the right's ambitions to dilute the net zero target. So Jutta's already given us some ideas about speaking more on the costs of inaction and what that would actually imply. That could be kind of financial, but that could also be geopolitical in terms of the measures that we might sort of have to take and the way in which we might have to evolve relationships with neighbours and others around us. If we choose instead to, if that can really be called choosing, to live with higher temperatures. But yeah, sort of views around the group on what can help persuade voters on this front who are struggling with the costs of decarbonisation, you know, and the debacle in Germany over heat pumps and the ULEZ debate in London are sort of highlighted as some examples on that front that you might want to draw on. And I think I will just add one more in that's just come in, and then we'll do a tour de table if that's okay. A question about migration in weaponized. No, sorry, it's not about weaponization of migration. It's a question about the extent to which the challenge of some of the partnerships that we're going to need to shore up supplies intersect with other aspects of our geopolitical relations with neighbours. So the question is particularly looking at whether or not the exodus of ethnic Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh makes it likely that the Commission is going to need to rethink its agreement with Azerbaijan on the gas front, and how we can manage that question. And maybe, if I'm allowed, I will broaden that question out as well to the group for any reflections that you might have on whether there's a sort of a broader strategy that we can think of in line with the recent communication on the economic security strategy, which might bring in this issue of looking at the partnerships we're going to need to sustain our energy supplies using green tech and green developments. And Pierre, you've already started to this conversation in relation to the CRMs that we're going to need, but sort of thinking more broadly about energy partnerships, whether there are particular strategic questions we should take into account. So does anyone want to go first, or shall I pick on someone? Well, I'm going to pick on you then, Shimon, because you got a specific question.
Yes.
You're muted.
Yes, thank you very much for the question and for all the comments. And starting from the question regarding cleaners, I mean, since we wanted to make a particular emphasis on the need for the development of renewables, I mean, basically the indicators that we were working with while preparing the final scores in this particular category were related to renewables. So the we used the data related to electricity generation from renewable energy sources per capita, share of renewables in the electricity generation in a particular country, renewable energy share of electricity capacity in general. We also wanted to identify, I mean, what is the progress in terms of those indicators that I have mentioned between 2021 and 2022. And we also included the indicators related to share of renewables in the share of fossil fuels in the electricity generation in those countries. I mean, in order to receive the final score. So I mean, basically, since we wanted to somehow, I mean, put an emphasis on the renewable element, we basically, I mean, were working with indicators related to it while preparing, I mean, the final scores for cleaners. And if I may, just a quick comment on what Pierre said. I mean, Pierre, thank you so much for your very valuable comments. I mean, related to the tool. I appreciate it, and yeah, I fully agree that actually, I mean, the approach is maybe not totally new, but we felt that when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started, I mean, in many countries, and it was quite visible when we read the questionnaires that we received from the national researchers, that in many countries, actually, politicians or some influential figures that are involved in the decision-making processes, we're putting more emphasis in the energy sovereignty issues in a, let's say, more narrow sense. So, I mean, we need to, first of all, focus on the security of supply. So we need to focus on the diversification. And we felt that there is some kind of a risk that this narrow approach might, let's say, prevail as a general approach in the first years since the invasion started. So that's why we thought that it would be really good, I mean, to reinforce this broader approach to the question of energy sovereignty, and that's why I mean decided to design the tool in a way that we eventually did. We simply thought that there will be the main focus on diversification and less, let's say, less engagement in energy transition activities. And secondly, yeah, I fully agree that I mean the source of import is absolutely important thing. But at the same time, I mean, when we look at the data related to the cost of imports, even from alternative sources of supply, I mean, alternative to Russia, I mean, the costs are really high, and Poland is probably one of the good examples in this respect, because actually the cost of energy import in Poland in 2022 doubled actually. So yeah, so I mean we thought that it would be good, I mean, to address the question of energy sovereignty and the need to decrease the level of dependence. I mean, regardless the source, because in general, I mean, that may contribute to strengthening the energy sovereignty in a broader sense. Okay, I'll stop here right now. Thank you so much once again, Pierre. For
Pierre, let's go to you next, and you can respond on any point that you want to. But I would be particularly grateful if you wanted to comment on the bioenergy question, what role you see for that, and also whether you wanted to talk about the implications of what's happening in Nagorno-Karabakh for the Azerbaijan deal.
No, on that issue, no. I think it's too early to go more.
Okay, fine.
I mean, that is
fine.
But on the bioenergy side, I mean, in all our models leading to climate neutrality. And by the way, I think there is one interesting thing about. I delve a bit into the political debate. I have not seen any serious political force in Europe really questioning the climate neutrality target for 2050. That I think there is indeed, and I think you to explain it very well. There are indeed debates on the level of ambition and so forth, but the climate neutrality as such is one very good thing with European legislation. It takes a lot of time to do, a lot of efforts. Jutta knows all about it. She's been vital to some pieces of legislation that we have. But one of the very strong aspects of EU legislation is that is its stability once it's done. And it's once it's there, it is a very stable framework for whatever happens, including what can happen sometimes in member states. So I think that is a strong aspect. All our models we have towards 2050 recognize a very important role for biomass or for bioenergy in general. And then, of course, we need to combine this with the fact that we need a sink. And here you have, you might know that we are on the rather intense debates in Parliament and Council on the certification scheme for carbon removals. It's a very difficult topic. But it's the first time we would have a legal structure for actually really measuring carbon removals. So you need to make sure that use of bioenergy, which as such is not necessarily in any way a bad thing, is balanced with a maintained sink. You know that the natural sink, at least in Europe, has had a tendency to go down these last years, and that is of course now in legislation for 2030. We need to bring it back, and so that is the balance that you need to ensure. But that is possible with different techniques and depending on what you use in terms of bioenergy. So it is one of the key components of the transition.
Thank you very much indeed. Matt, I'd like to come to you, and as you're speaking to us from the US, I thought I would ask you particularly if you wanted to comment on a question that we've had come in on expectations from the EU-US summit in terms of climate ambitions and the extent to which Europeans so far have just been too compliant with the IRA, and what the implications of that might be for our perceptions of us as a free trading bloc.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, and this just recently announced summit later now in October. I think that will be really important. Of course, there are these trade tensions, and to find a kind of prolongation of the current avoidance of a trade war and the solution when it comes to this global agreement on sustainable steel and aluminium. I think that's really an important part of it, to kind of diffuse those tensions as far as possible. But I also think it's important to put this in the wider perspective, as you had another question about international partnerships, because if the EU and the US can at this summit also kind of do this as a more reaching out to other parts of the world and avoid this rather strong North-South conflict that we're having, that's important. And what I also hear from my conversation here in Washington, D.C. is that there is this will in the Biden administration also to forge better partnerships with the Global South. And I think now be in view also of the competition with China to be much more concrete from both the EU and US side, what are the real offers to the Global South. This links to the trade conflicts in general and the survival of the Green Deal, because CBAM will be very difficult if everybody is against it in other parts of the world, so to speak. So just on that, and then I just wanted to add to what Jytte also said very rightly, there is also reason to be optimistic. This study we done shows that there is a strong support for climate policies and the awareness of the climate risks that we are having. I think that's also important to say. And very briefly on the advantages and the way of discussing this, I saw the Commission put out now a summary of the results of the Recovery and Resilience Facility, and that is very important to promote, I think, what's happening on the ground. There's so much happening on the ground with what's already done, but this has to be, I mean, Ursula von der Leyen went around every member state, I think, with the agreements, and now there's not time for that, there's elections, but that I think is really important to show what's already happening, also in the context, as you just said, when India and others are moving forward. But I'll stop there, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mats. So Jytte, we'll come to you for the final comments. And as with the others, you can of course comment on what you'd like to, but I would be keen to get your take on the narratives that you think we need to push back against the far right in particular. And maybe you also might want to react. Pierre mentioned earlier in the conversation that the money question is important in terms of the extent to which we can put a serious social offer on the table to help to sort of underpin the political messaging about the fact that the transition is genuinely something on which Europeans are committed to sharing the costs, and what you think the ways forward might be to drive that agenda in today's Europe.
Thank you, Susie, and thank you also to the whole panel. Very interesting to listen to all of you. Yes, I think there is absolutely hope to have a momentum next year when it comes to the transition and have a climate-friendly, sustainable debate for the future when it comes to in the election movement. And I think three things I can mention three things elements that should be there. One is that we need to move because if you stand still in politics, it's dangerous. If you just speak about what you have done and would like to add some small pieces, you will be so easily shot because you stand still, it's easy to see you. And that is something, it's something for almost all political election, it's a truth. And even where you are, even if you're governing or opposition, wherever, if you're very happy where you were and you're not thinking about the future, and if you don't have an idea about the future, it would be super easy to shoot you down. And I think when it comes to climate, we are a little bit in risk of being shut down, even though I definitely agree to what's been said from all of you that there is lots of stability there also when it comes to the legislation that's already there. And Pierre mentioned how the how the EU legislation is very sustainable and strong. And I absolutely agree, and I really hope so also, because we put effort into it and I was part of it, so I really would like to defend it. But I do think that if there is this conservative or populistic or even the extreme right are very aggressive in the election movement, and if the answer among progressive movements is let's defend the Green Deal, that will not be helpful. We need to have an agenda for the future, and it needs to be a vocal agenda. Like we need a Green Deal too, but we can't call it that. But it needs to be a sustainable agenda, and it needs to address things in a little bit different way, both the energy situation, the prices, but also the need for new pieces of legislation when it comes to cutting on emissions, and then also financing the transition. We have started it, the EU have started it with different funding systems, and also on the now on Repower EU, but it needs to be a bit more. How do we make all the private actors to really do more when it comes to the economic investments and the co-founding of the green transition? So that's for the sustainable agenda. Then on the how to defend against the far right, that's what I said. It's important to move and have our own agenda, but it's also important to attack them on the plus effects on climate, because it will be very difficult for them to say, let's put this down, if we say, okay, but our business are gaining from it. The welfare is gaining from it. Would you like to take money from the welfare? Would you like to take money from the industry? So we need to be able to show how much money they would like to take away from industry, from the welfare, if they are attacking the climate legislation or climate investments that are done. So I think that's one way, and they can't defend themselves when we do that, because that's unexpected for them. Okay, I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I think you've given us a really helpful finishing point in summary, that there has been much done. There is indeed much still to do, but it is doable with the right focus and with a sense of mainstreaming the green agenda into everything that we're doing. So thank you for giving us that relatively optimistic note to finish on. So I'm going to bring the discussion to a close. We've gone 1 minute over. I'm sorry for that, but I found the conversation fascinating, and I would like to say thank you very much to Pierre Schellekens for joining us, to Jutta Götterlund for joining us, to Mats Engström for joining us, and to Shimon Kardas for joining us. I think it's been a really rich conversation and lots to take forward. To all the rest of you whose names I don't know, who've been online through the whole thing, thank you as well for your input and for your interest. And I would encourage you, you've heard a lot today about two of the publications which I mentioned at the beginning, the Energy Sovereignty Index and the paper on the European political landscape, which is called Ends of the Earth on the ECFR site. I would encourage you to go back and take a look at the third one, which we haven't really had time to get into detail on Poland's energy transition, which is going to be absolutely a crucial part of the European picture. It's called From Coal to Consensus, and Shimon has written that one as well. So thank you very much and have a good rest of day.